When you think of medieval warfare, you probably imagine knights in shining armour, banners fluttering in the wind, and the gallant charge of noble warriors. Hollywood has done a wonderful job of selling us that image. But the reality? Well, the reality was much closer to an absolute nightmare. The sights, sounds, and smells, none of them fit neatly into the romantic tales of chivalry. And if you're unlucky enough to find yourself on a medieval battlefield, your chances of survival? Let's just say you'd be better off taking up a career in alchemy. Medieval battles weren't neat, they weren't organised, and they certainly weren't fair. Most men who fought had little to no training. Weapons weren't always well maintained. And in medical care, let's just say that if you took a wound, you'd probably be seeing more of the afterlife than a doctor. So what did warfare really look like? And how did it change the world in ways you wouldn't expect? First, let's talk about the weapons. The sword gets all the glory, but in reality, the most effective weapons were often the least glamorous. Take the humble polearm pikes, halberds, and billhooks. Farmers used them to cut wood or butcher animals, and that's exactly what they did to enemy soldiers. These weapons were so effective that they made heavily armoured knights, who cost a fortune to train and equip, less valuable than a bunch of angry peasants with long sticks. A notable example is the Battle of Morgarten in 1315. During this conflict, Swiss forces employed halberds to devastating effect against Austrian knights. Contemporary chronicler Conrad Justinger described the scene. The Swiss held in their hands certain, most terrible murder weapons, known in the vernacular as Hellbarten, by means of which even the best armed opponents were cut apart as with a razor blade, and hacked to pieces. This brings us to the sword. Ah, the sword, the symbol of medieval combat, carried by kings, knights, and just about every hero in a fantasy novel. But how effective was it, really? Well, that depends. A well-made sword was a marvel of engineering, perfectly balanced, sharp enough to cut, and strong enough to thrust. But, and this is the important bit, it wasn't some magical weapon that could slice through armour like butter. In fact, against plate armour, a sword was about as useful as a butter knife. Knights had to aim for the gaps, under the arm, at the visor, behind the knee, if they wanted to do any real damage. If you were fighting someone in a full plate, you didn't try to slice them up like a roast chicken. Instead, you'd use a technique called half-swording, gripping the blade with one hand and using it like a short spear to thrust into weak points. Or you might just flip the sword around and use the pommel or crossguard to bludgeon your opponent into submission. So much for elegant dueling. And then there's this, arguably one of the most disruptive technologies of the medieval battlefield, the crossbow. This little device was so devastating that the Pope tried to ban its use against fellow Christians in 1139. Now, this wasn't about divine morality. After all, swords, axes, and maces were still fine. No, the real problem was that the crossbow threatened the social order. A peasant with one of these could kill a noble knight from 200 yards away with minimal training. Imagine the horror among the ruling class. A weapon that rendered their expensive armour and decades of training completely irrelevant. Not exactly the noble, hand-to-hand combat of legend. Speaking of the longbow, if you really wanted to deal death at a distance, it was king. And this wasn't just something anyone could pick up and use. You see, English law actually required men to practice archery every Sunday. From childhood, they'd build up the incredible strength needed to pull a longbow with a draw weight sometimes exceeding 150 pounds. That's the equivalent of pulling back a modern compound bow, twice. If you didn't practice, well, let's just say the local authorities wouldn't be too pleased. And the reason for all this archery practice? Because when war came, the king needed thousands of these highly trained archers ready to rain death on the enemy. At the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, English archers decimated the French nobility in a slaughter that reshaped the balance of power in Europe. Think about it. An army of commoners wiping out the aristocracy. That's not just a military victory, it's a shift in the entire social order. And then there's a problem of what happens after the battle. If you were wounded, your odds weren't great. Surgeons didn't have antiseptics, and infection was usually more deadly than the weapons themselves. In fact, battlefield medicine wouldn't make significant strides until centuries later. So, if you took an arrow to the leg, there was a good chance you'd end up having it removed with nothing more than a strong drink and a few men to hold you down. And if the wound festered, well, you'd be meeting your maker sooner rather than later. But let's say you survived the battle. Congratulations! Now you have to deal with the exhaustion, the hunger, the disease spreading through camp, and the very real possibility that your own commander might refuse to pay you. Because medieval warfare wasn't just about fighting, it was also about politics, economics, and sometimes plain old treachery. And then gunpowder arrived. This changed everything. By the late Middle Ages, cannons were smashing castle walls, and the first crude handguns were making armour obsolete. In just a few centuries, the armoured knight would be a thing of the past, replaced by mass armies of gun-wielding infantry. And with that, medieval warfare as we knew it was over. So, next time you watch a Hollywood battle scene, remember this. Real medieval warfare wasn't about heroic duels or grand charges. It was brutal, messy, and often pointless. But it also shaped the world in ways you'd never expect, leading to new technologies, shifting power structures, and the slow, painful birth of the modern world. And in the end, isn't it fascinating how something so violent and chaotic could help build the civilization we live in today?